First off, I want to thank the brave men and women who work behind the wall. I want to thank them on a national level because their job goes unrecognized.
How do they try to turn a guard?
Well, correctional officer. Sorry, I apologize. But correctional officer.
How you guys doing today? Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Today we're going to be discussing managing prison informants. And of course, who am I going to bring on my show to discuss that? Russ Hamilton, what's up? Russ, like, you don't have your volume on. No volume. Let's see, Russ, how he handles this code. There we go.
Is that better?
That's better. Was that your code face?
That was my I'm completely mystified face. I don't know, something's going on with my phone tonight.
I think I'm going to keep that, Russ. Okay, so hey, real quick, Russ. First off, thanks for taking time to come on. Hey, how's Keeper of Chaos going on Facebook? How's that group going?
Oh, I couldn't be more pleased. We just hit 1,400 members today, so we're growing. Of course, some of you that know me know that I've been very sick for the past week. I'm just getting over that. So I'm back to tending to my garden of Keepers of Chaos now. My moderators did a great job. They grew it while I was gone, but now I can afford to come back and start adding some content and doing some of the things that have been promising now that I feel a little better.
Yeah, and guys, by the way, if you haven't, check out the Facebook page, Keepers of Chaos. A lot of great information. Again, over 1,400 followers now, and that's just over a month. That's great, man. And again, I enjoy it. I follow it. And just a lot of good. Again, just a lot of good information. Hey, before we start discussing prison informants, I want to mention something. And I shared this on my social media outlets. So a friend of mine sends a message to me today. Now, check this out, Russ. This is the message I get. Now, real quick, he's talking about a place called Happy Habits in Newburgh, New York. Happy Habits in Newburgh, New York. Hey, bro, long time no chat. Hope all is well. I just wanted to pass along an experience my coworker had today. Went to a vape shop in the Hudson Valley area of New York. He went to pay for his items, and the cashier saw his shield in his wallet and asked him if he was law enforcement because they have a discount. When he replied, yes, he was, and he was a CO, he was told that he wasn't law enforcement. The girl called another cashier over, and he confirmed it. So my coworker messaged the company on Facebook and received this. So the coworker said, when did correctional officers lose their law enforcement status? And the response back from Happy Habits out of Newburgh, New York was, we are sure you are well aware being a CO is not considered law enforcement. And by you identifying yourself as law enforcement, you actually committed a felony. Now, first off, maybe they just don't know, but it's a very generalized statement, by the way. He's not talking about a specific state. He's talking about actual just COs in general. And what he doesn't probably realize, whoever this person is from Happy Habits, is that in New York, in New Jersey, I believe in California, along with many other states, and obviously there's that fight for recognition on a national level, COs are law enforcement. So, especially in this state, New York, they're wrong. Happy Habits out of Newburgh, New York. Maybe we should go over, check out their site, check out their Facebook page, and just, educate them. Fair enough, right, Russ?
Oh, absolutely. That's one thing we should always be willing to do as ambassadors of our profession, is be willing to educate those who simply don't know.
Right, and I was happy enough to post this on Keepers of Chaos.
Yes, and it's getting some feedback now, even as we speak.
And they don't mind educating the public, I'm sure.
Oh, no. We're absolutely, man. All of my people at Keepers of Chaos, all the keepers, they're solid.
All right, guys. So when we come back from our sponsors, we're going to discuss managing prison informants. We're going to talk about how to manage them, basically how to verify their information, the feeling of obligation we may get when dealing with a prison informant, and just the do's and don'ts. When we come back from our sponsors, me and Russ are going to have quite an interesting dialogue. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you brave men and women that work on that front line in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell's going to notify you every time I post up a video. And all right, guys, stand by for our sponsors.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, guys, we're back. Now, Russ, this is a very interesting topic. I don't think this is something that we've discussed together before. I have done this on an individual level, so you could check out that video, but we've never discussed it together, correct?
We've discussed a lot of stuff, Anthony, so I'm going to say for now, yes, we haven't discussed this.
I'm sure we could have squeezed it into something, but we definitely never devoted a topic to it.
Definitely.
Okay, so Russ, obviously as a supervisor in corrections, you know, you were a sergeant, you dealt with prison informants, correct? And before you answer that, guys, I want you to comment below. We're not going to answer it here. What do you think is the difference between a prison informant and a snitch? That's for you guys to comment on. Now, Russ, have you ever dealt with prison informants before?
Oh yeah, I've dealt with prison informants. I've dealt with investigation services that sometimes run those individuals if they're at high enough level. And I've written and authored literally hundreds of confidential memos with regard to the information that I've been given by these individuals.
Now, just so the public's aware, when dealing with prison informants, we do have a priority in dealing with those inmates' safety, correct, Russ?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the safety of inmates overall is always a high priority. And when something is happening with regard to developing intel and that sort of thing, you absolutely have to insulate and protect your sources, because otherwise, you're in for, you know, just some horrible liability, and all kinds of other bad things can occur.
And I will tell you something right now. I have seen people scramble in an effort to protect their informant. I've seen it many times where somehow or another the informant may get moved from one unit to another, and all of a sudden you'll see like investigators coming out of nowhere looking to protect their source of information. And again, obviously, if we're being trusted to hold on to this information, which obviously can put the inmate at risk, we have to make sure that we handle that information correctly and make sure that we minimize the risk it puts on the inmate's well-being. Correct, Russ?
Absolutely. You know, there's no way you can overstate what the problem there is with regard to, you know, keeping inmates safe.
Right, and there's a very unique relationship between an inmate informant and the person that handles their information. So whether it's an investigator or a supervisor, and the relationship to me, I just want to make people aware that the inmate informant, we are not obligated to them, and that's where there's kind of a boundary here. When an inmate provides someone with information, there could be that feeling of obligation that now the person that receives the information has to give back. And that's where we kind of got into this reward system. And I'm kind of on the fence with rewarding inmates for information. People are like, well, how else are you going to get information? That's kind of where there's a bit of a conflict, because believe it or not, there is some information that comes our way that's very useful that is volunteered, and we'll get to that because there's a lot of different reasons why inmates choose to give up information. But my concern is if we reward the inmate, sometimes the motivation to give information isn't about giving in the information. It's about getting the reward, and that's when we start putting ourselves in a position where we may just get information just so that inmate can get something from it. So, Russ, this is kind of, we're on the fence, and I know some people are going to comment here. So, again, guys, comment if you believe that inmates that give information that's good information should always be rewarded. But, Russ, in your experience, should we reward inmates that give us information, or is there kind of a context here where, yeah, you could reward some but not all?
Okay, as a general rule, I feel that they should not receive a reward. However, there are some instances where the information is of such a sensitive and safety-oriented nature that a reward should be delved into, because sometimes that's the only way they'll part with it. I know of instances, some of which I even hesitate to even mention, where huge. How would I put this? Huge security impacts on the institution would have happened without inmates providing that information in a quid pro quo kind of scenario.
Now, what kind of rewards are we talking about here?
I know of rewards where inmates were rewarded with basically getting moved to a different institution. I know of a couple of different instances where inmates were offered to not be prosecuted for certain crimes, and some things like that. But overall, in general, it was never my policy to reward them with anything. You know, their do-gooder status, that had to be reward enough.
Right, I agree. And one thing is there is that feeling of obligation. If the inmate does give you good information, there is that feeling of obligation that some may have towards that inmate. And I can understand why the reward may want to come into play, because it neutralizes that feeling of obligation. Like, okay, you did for me, well, I'm going to do for you, and we're even. And believe it or not, guys, feeling of obligation can be very, very overwhelming. I deal with that when it comes to inmate manipulation. But again, when it comes to rewards, my concerns are going to be is that inmates will use bogus information to manipulate the system to get whatever that reward is. Like in some cases, a housing move, if you will. But again, when it comes to rewarding the inmate, that's why I feel when it comes to having real prison informants, you may want to have those prison informants handled at a higher level, because those people are able to handle or give out those rewards like a housing move, or because in some cases frontline staff may not have the ability to do that, or if they're working with an investigator, forward whatever it is to the prosecutor to see if they're willing to drop something from whatever it is that they're being charged with, maybe some type of petty crimes or maybe a fine. I'm sure there's some type of negotiations that could be made, but again, that's why it's kind of left at a higher level. I think the front line, yes, we do get our information, and obviously it does come our way, but we are most likely going to forward that up the chain because they can have the bigger impact on how they deal with that information. And again, it's great to get it from the front line. Front line's listening, front line's observant, but I still feel that some of the information, especially as I moved up in the field, needs to be brought higher level, because if that information is not filtered, an officer at the lower level may jeopardize either something that could be going on and the inmate's trying to play a game, or could even put the officer's life at risk. So it's good to have a bigger picture before someone runs with any information provided to them. And that's where those in higher positions may have the ability to filter out that information. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Well, yeah, you know, the information that we get from informants like that, it comes basically in different styles. You have those things that are effective, you know, to the outside, such as, you know, contraband, that's being smuggled inside, possibly escape attempts, possibly contacts with STG groups. And then you have those things that tend to affect more of just the units themselves, which can be, you know, internal contraband trading, you know, rivalries between STG groups, possibly hits that are being put out on different inmates, and those sort of things. So you got to kind of take into account, you know, what type of information that you're receiving. And what I would do as a supervisor, a lot of times, I'd be a bridge, per se, between inmates that were involved in giving information and the investigative unit, and, you know, trying to be able to, you know, pass some messages back and forth, because obviously they can't always be seen talking to, you know, that particular inmate. Sometimes they have to, you know, go through intermediaries. And so on those things, sometimes you just really had to watch it, though, because those are much higher level stakes, because you're talking about potential prison sentences for people that are involved. The other things that happen at the lower level in the units, you know, assaults, internal drug distribution, and all those other sort of things, you can tend to actually be the one that's running those, as long as you're passing that information up the chain, just in case it impacts something in between that you've not been made privy to, or that they may not even know about yet.
And that's why it's important to pass the information up. But I also want to tell you other things too, guys. You guys know that sometimes inmates can be testing you when they give you information to see where you go with it, because the thing is, sometimes an inmate will try to come up to you and tell you something in confidence. And that could be a test to see if you're willing to keep a secret for them. You know, if you're willing to not go outside of this trusted circle the inmate now established. So an inmate may tell you something and they know right off the bat you're going to have to act on this. But if you choose not to act on it, the inmates can be like, okay, I could play with this guy because, or this female, because obviously they don't communicate with their support staff or their peers or their supervisors. All they do is basically trust me and harbor the information. I told him something yesterday, whatever it was should have been acted on by now. So obviously he didn't say anything or she didn't say anything. And it kind of, it showcases to the inmate that you're not communicating with staff. That's why anytime an inmate tells you something, I always say, whoa, there's no confidence here between me and you. Whatever you tell me, I am going to report it to my supervisor. And the inmates need to see that that communication exists, because I've seen a lot of inmates pretend that they're trying to be informants to that front line. And next thing you know, this person, this officer and this inmate got this rapport, and all these things are happening in the unit, and no supervisor knows what's going on because the inmate is playing the officer. Have you ever seen that, where an inmate tries to talk to an officer or a staff member in confidence, hoping that the staff member is not going to travel out with the conversation?
Oh, yeah. I've seen that where they're testing them to see where they go with it. I've seen them where they test them just by giving them some general knowledge that's not worth anything and seeing what they get in return. You know, maybe they're being bought off with a little bit of that canteen that we always keep in the locker down at the end of the hall. Or I've even seen them, I've actually seen them work supervisors by giving them a bunch of bogus general stuff that you could see and figure out just by watching your yard for the day. And the supervisor thinks he's getting some great information, and he's not. You have to be cognizant of that fact. You know what? Sooner or later, and at one time or another, no matter how good we are, we'll get worked a little bit, but we won't get worked all the time.
Yeah, and I agree. And that's why it's good to have that support, because that eliminates the all the time aspect. Because obviously we all can get played, we're human, but at least if we have each other's back, we're kind of watching out for each other to make sure that, yeah, of course we can get played, but you know what? Sometimes I've been played before and I know not to fall for it again. And that's where we get to communicate with each other and learn from each other's experiences, which is always key. And getting back to talking about the informants real quick, a lot of people may not realize why an inmate chooses to become a prison informant. So I thought we could discuss some of the motivations that inmates have to give up information. So, you know, I guess we can go a little back and forth here, Russ. So I'm going to name one right off the top of the bat. What I'll do is, how about this, Russ? I'll name some manipulative motivations, and you can name some of the positive motivations.
Okay.
And then we'll try to build a balance. And guys, comment below, see if we're missing anything. Okay, so I'm going to work on the manipulative motivations. Okay, so one is to manipulate a housing move to maybe better whatever form of business they got running in the units.
Oh, absolutely. And then, if I was to try and pick one that I thought might be a good one, I realize this is a little bit of an umbrella one, but believe it or not, some of these inmates actually have a conscience, and they don't want to see somebody get, hurt or destroyed in possibly even in their career. If it's from an officer's end, they might come forward out of a genuine sincerity for that. Now, I'm not saying that that's all the time, but it does happen, and I've seen it.
And you know what? I'm going to add on that, because there's some inmates that obviously prison's going to be their life, and they don't want disruptions in their unit. So what they're going to do is, if there's people that are selling drugs and that unit's constantly in the spotlight, and they're constantly getting disrupted with searches and whatnot, they get tired of it all. And sometimes you'll get those anonymous notes, or sometimes they'll walk right in front of the CO and they'll tell the CO, yo, this is what's going on. I'm tired of you guys coming into my area, and this is what it is. Because again, remember, these inmates have to live there. So it makes sense. And again, they're doing it, yes, because, obviously there may be some good intent, but most of the reasons why is because this is my neighborhood, this is my house, and right now these guys are bringing too much attention to my house. Correct, Russ? I mean, that's pretty much one of the reasons why they would just volunteer information.
Yeah, that's why I'd say, a lot of information actually gets elicited that way. And, there's many times where guys, especially with regard to warring STGs. I mean, I've had so many guys, just because of the fact that a yard was going to jump off and we were going to have a riot, that they've been willing to sit there and point out and say, hey, these guys right here, they are the ones that are stirring the pot, and they are the ones that if you get rid of them, it will go away. And of course, you always have to be dubious, because you don't know. Maybe all you're doing is helping them expand their territory. And even if it cools down afterwards, that still might be what you've done. And you have to try and weigh those things, but sometimes your only choice at the same time is to remove those individuals and see what happens.
Well, that's because, again, it's the universal precaution. Sometimes information could be just a power move, to gain power. Like, if I, let's say I'm part of a group and we're starting to get overwhelmed, sometimes anonymous notes or things will come out, come the officer's way that tries to manipulate some moves so one entity can get power over the other or get that power back. That's why it's always good to have those higher levels check out that information. Again, in partnership with the front line. Don't get me wrong, because front line obviously knows their units the best, but it's still good for them to partner with those investigative agencies because they may be privy to higher information. But again, sometimes the information that's provided by these prison informants, and again, I'm talking about the manipulative side here, is for power moves, is to gain power because they may feel that they're losing power. That could become from, if they're selling items and maybe someone else is selling something, so they want to get this person out so they can make their sales, or to get power in the unit. Empty out some inmates, get some inmates that relate to my culture, my group, and I gain some power and control. But again, it's all a game at that point about power. And also, if I may ask, sometimes inmates, again, talking about the manipulation side, sometimes inmates look to give out information to get favor from staff, or like we mentioned before, get a reward. That's also very dangerous because we don't want staff owing the inmate population anything. We don't want staff to feel obligated towards inmates. So again, that information that inmate is providing is hoping maybe, okay, I do this for you, what are you going to do for me? And again, that's where you need that control. What else you got, Russ?
I would say that also, when this information is being presented to you, I mean, you have to really be a purveyor of that information, in the fact that you have to be willing to assess and not take it at face value. You have to be asking yourself questions inside your head as to why, and seeing if you can assign a motive to it and figure out how many motives you have to get to before you get to the right one. It may be on face value that what they're telling you is correct, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their motive is.
Yeah, and so, guys, that's 100%. You never take the information blindly. Inmates that give up information, as Russ saying, some of them do have a motive. It may not be a motive that we see on the surface, but it's there. So it's always good to ask the inmate, hey, why are you providing this to me? How do you benefit from this? And let them see that, you're not desperate for that information. That's another thing, guys. If you appear desperate and you're the kind of person that chases for information instead of some cases letting the information come your way, that desperation is going to wind up getting you false information, and you're going to be running around like a chicken without its head, but you're going to be making some bad choices. Russ, have you ever seen people just so desperate for information, for either because maybe they want to get something, because maybe something's about ready to happen, or they just want their name on something?
Yeah, we talk about, in what we're doing here on this video, we talk about the inmate motivation, but we also have to look at what our own motivators are too. And anyone can be guilty of trying to look good in the limelight. I'm sure I've had my times where that's what I wanted. So you have to really watch the reasons that you're doing it for. And so your base reason always has to be safety and security. So if that's your fallback thing, that's fine. But if you think that the only way that you're going to be able to move your career or your status or your star ahead is by chasing a bunch of information, I think you're going about it the wrong way, because there's other ways that you can push yourself into the limelight and make people realize how good of a job you can do, besides just chasing cheap information. Because information, sooner or later, it's going to be bad, it's going to be wrong, it's going to come back and bite you. That should only be one aspect of what you're working. There's other things you can be doing out there. You can be reading inmate body language and doing searches and being cognizant of who's coming in and what tattoos are out there and how the groups are looking on the yard. It's not just about information, because information is easy because everybody wants to look at it at face value. But if you get into it and you've really done it for a while, it's not that easy, because all these, competing motivations and revenge and territories and all that stuff come into play. And unless you've been at this job a while, that's really hard for you to assess.
Also, information that you need to filter the information that you're getting. You may not know everything at a ground level, especially at the higher level where they're doing things a little bit more discreet. So you need to have information on the information that you're getting. And again, that's how you manage what's coming your way. Now, again, going back to what Russ was saying with the safety and security, and we kind of touched on it briefly, you also have to be able to protect the inmate that's giving you the information. So if I know, first off, any inmate that provides me with information, I want them to be aware of what the consequences are. So this may sound weird, guys, but I'm not looking to get information from inmates that, even though they may have the answer, and it's sad to say, but that have limited IQ, highly special needs. Because again, this inmate, yeah, he may be telling you, and that's great, we can act on it, but he may not be trusted to protect himself, let alone now this relationship that we're having where they're providing this information. And now I got to look to protect them, but people are going to look at me and like, yo, you're using this individual. So you're telling me you're using an individual with a limited IQ who probably has no means to protect themselves or no means to understand what the consequences of the information that they're providing. I think when I use inmates that decide to be informants, these are inmates. I try my best to make sure that the motivations are pure, but again, that's never going to be 100%. Most of the time, some of the good information I have that come my way is based on the respect I have earned with these inmates. But again, I'm not going to, depending on what the information is, I can't say, because sometimes there obviously is emergent information that you have to act on immediately. But I'm not looking for inmates that don't understand the information that they're providing me or don't understand the consequences of the information that provided me. And I want to make sure that because remember, dealing with information, there's a risk that you're putting also on yourself, but also on that inmate. It's got to be a trust factor where if that inmate's giving you that information, not that many people know that inmate's providing it to you. So if you have someone, I've seen inmates that just blurt it out, that just volunteer information to you in front of like 20 million other people. And the problem is what they don't realize is not only are they putting their lives at risk, they're also putting your life at risk. So you want to be careful how you manage inmates that don't have that higher level of education or don't understand the consequences of the information that they're providing you. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, we have, as part of the fact that, we're law enforcement and that we have a duty, part of those duties is to provide safety for the public, provide safety for the inmates, provide safety for us. And you can't just think that it's okay to go out there and leave a source hanging. What's that going to do for your reputation and for your rapport with other potential sources down the line? And when you're talking about, especially in situations where you might be talking about a situation where an inmate is giving you actionable intelligence, where there's going to be a drug bust happen on a visitor or someone coming by in a car or what have you, it's a huge responsibility, and you have to take it very seriously. We have other levels of intel where that has more to do with STGs and enemies and things like that, but also that we still have to be able to assess and be able to write clearly in our reports why we believe this inmate, why we believe an enemy situation exists, and be able to list bullet point down the line why this inmate is a good, reliable source. I had an incident that happened later in my career where everything came down and hinged on the fact that I had previously made an inmate months and months and months before a confidential informant who was reliable. And that came down to, it ended up being a foot chase I had with an inmate that had 4 weapons on him. And so I was able to bust that inmate. The inmate that had actually moved the weapons, I couldn't have ever touched him or got him the extra 360 days that he got if I hadn't done my homework and previously made a guy way, way, way back into a confidential informant who was reliable. So you have to follow through on all these things.
And it's funny, you just gave me another motivation why an inmate may choose to snitch. Obviously, we're never going to cover them all. We don't have enough time to do that. But when an inmate gets in trouble inside the prison system, they may decide to, trade some information just to get them out of going to lock. And that's usually a good chance for us to barter. But again, you have to trade what has more value, the information you're giving me or the charge that you just got caught with. So depending on, what you feel has more value or what's more immediate to your needs at that point. Now, when it comes to verifying information that the inmate's providing you, again, you may have sources, but you need sources on your sources. So the first thing I usually do, especially if it's an inmate I'm not too familiar with, is I go to my peers first. Now, I know, Russ, we'll talk about different avenues. Everybody could have a different method in doing it, but I definitely go to the officers, see if anybody knows anything about this inmate. Who is this inmate? Is this inmate reliable? Has this inmate ever given any information in the past? I mean, obviously, Russ, when you're dealing with a informant, you do look at their history, correct, to see if they've ever given out credible information before?
Yeah, I look at a host of things. I have a list of bullet points that I follow with regard to assessing the information. One of them is if he's ever given, prior reliable information. Another one is if I have another independent source, not the guy that's living with him in the cell or in the same dorm, but some other independent source. I look to whether or not he's given me any information which incriminates him in a crime. Because if he's incriminated himself in a crime, there's a pretty good chance that he's telling the truth, right? And then the other criteria generally tends to be whether or not he's the victim. If he's been beat up and hurt and looking to get back or looking to keep himself safe by telling who did it, then that's generally what we consider, okay, this guy's telling the truth. He really is telling us who actually beat him up. You
said you have a bullet list?
Yeah, it's actually in California. It's actually cited inside of Title 15, and it tells you how you can and can't make a confidential informant reliable.
Really?
Yeah, and so you have to get one of those things, one or more, in order to decide that the information that they've given you is reliable. Now you can report on other things, but in order to charge someone with a disciplinary or to send them to SEG or that sort of thing, you have to have that reliable information. And so that's one of the things. The last one that I was going to mention that really matters to what we're talking about here is part of the information is already proven to be true through other methods that are non-confidential. So that's the last one that I tend to look at. And those are all things that I really had to, when I'm writing my report, I really have to get in there and think about everything that's said and how everything panned out to try and get as many of those points in there as I can to try and make my informant reliable.
Yeah, because if it ever goes to court, you have to establish credibility for your informant. So people have to.
And my goal was always never to go to court, and I never did. So,
yeah. But I like what you just said, and I think that's why it's put in the laws, is that you have to establish credibility by your informant. So obviously, doing what you did can establish that sense of credibility because that adds to the value of the statement that the inmate is providing you. You know what? Something else I look for, guys, just as advice, the circumstances into when and why the inmate's giving you the information. I think that's key too. Like you may get an inmate that, as I said, decides, at one point never had a history of snitching, but all of a sudden decides, you know what, I'm going to snitch on this. Well, you know, at that point, as you're getting the information, you need to go back and pretty much get to understand why that inmate at that point is deciding to give you that information, what's happening. Because again, I like what Russ kind of pointed at. You're also looking to validate the person giving you the information just as much as you're looking to validate the information itself. And it is one and the same, believe it or not, because the information is no good if you can't validate the individual that's giving you the information. Correct, Russ?
Yeah, and you also have to realize that when you're dealing with inmates, they don't always understand the difference between first-hand information and third-hand.
Right.
So when I'm interviewing them and they're running their story down to me, and especially if they're excited or something, I say, now wait a minute, did you see this happen? Or is this what Flacco told you later on the tier? And because sometimes for them, there's no distinction between that. So you have to be really careful because, you know, by the time the jailhouse gossip has got around to them, the information might be solid and it might be worth checking out, but it also might be completely foobar by that time.
Right. And let me ask, so I guess we'll kind of rattle off a list here too. What are some of the ways that inmates can provide staff with confidential information? Now, we're looking more on the anonymous side. So basically, it's not some inmate that walks right up to the officer and says, hey, I'm providing you this, or some inmate that's caught up in a situation looking to get out and providing information, or these are more on the anonymous side. And obviously, we do have those anonymous tips that we know are manipulative. You know, we know that you have a good housing unit officer doing his job, and sometimes inmates will drop a bogus note in a medical box saying, hey, there's a threat on this officer's life, knowing that we have to react and move that officer and do a proper investigation, which could buy time for the inmates to kind of maneuver what it is that they were trying to maneuver. Because sometimes those good officers, when they're onto something, the inmates know, and it's a game of chess. They get ahead of the game. And we know that, but unfortunately, we can't just put that person at risk because, again, the universal precaution. Plus, it is dangerous when you start trying to get at that higher level contraband. But one of the routes I'll tell you that you can get anonymous tips from is, as I just mentioned, those medical boxes, those request slip drop-offs. I don't know what different prisons may have different names for, different jails, but basically it's an anonymous drop. It's a drop box for, let's say, a department, and sometimes inmates could drop something in anonymously there because they know staff is going to read it. And then what we need is the department that receives that anonymous note must forward it either to the chain of command in custody, so maybe a supervisor of that area, depending on how that works. But most of the time what they'll do is they'll give it to their department supervisor, and then maybe the department supervisor will forward it up to administration or give it to the supervisor of custody. But either way, the main thing is that they turn in the anonymous note so it can be investigated. What are some of the other anonymous ways we could get tips?
You know, there's a million ways. One of the ways I used to often receive stuff is I would have porters that would be coming in and out of, you know, my office to clean it or something, and one of them comes in and no one else happens to be there, and, you know, boom, he blurts out 2 or 3 names and then walks out the door. I've had that happen many times. I've had situations where, you know, we're running phone banks, and I'm listening to inmates talk, and my guy will get on there and start his, you know, alleged phone conversation, but he's really talking to me. Right. You know, no one's the wiser. No one knows how to tell because I'm nowhere near him. That's about as much in depth as I really want to go into as far as methods, because I don't want to endanger anyone else's method by something else that I might say.
Of course. And guys, by the way, don't underestimate the power of an exit interview. When inmates are getting ready to leave that unit, supervisors should be talking to them. You know, don't let an inmate leave that facility without you guys talking to them, because at that point, that life's behind them, and you'll be shocked what they're willing to provide. The exit interview is a very powerful way to get some really good, credible information. Have you ever done exit interviews, Russ?
Yeah, I've done something very similar to them. Sometimes with inmates that are just, getting ready to be either transported away from the institution or to go to another unit. Sometimes I've had officers that were transporting them to the bus station to be paroled and said, hey, you know what? This guy, he's the only one with you today, or keep him in the van last. And man, ask him about this thing that's going on in my yard because something serious is here. And so the officer will do that for me, and sure enough, we'll get a little bit of information back.
Right, and I will tell you guys, obviously on the higher end, you get a lot of anonymous phone calls, whether it's from inmate families or a snitch line. So, and guys, what people don't realize is that information is what it makes the facility safer. Trust and believe that. It helps us do our job. It helps us get rid of the cancers that puts people's lives at risk. And ultimately, it is a needed element of what we do. People, we don't live there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're only there a portion of the day. They live there. They know it, So in order for us to govern the house, obviously a lot of the information that comes our way is through the inmates that live in those units. But the key is how you manage that information. And the inmates need to see that, by the way. And what I mean by that is the inmate that provides you with the information needs to see, as mentioned before, that you're not desperate, you're not running crazy with it, because they need to see that when they give you the information that you're still in control. See, inmates test that, and we mentioned that a little before, but inmates test. When they give you information, they test what you're going to do with that information. And believe it or not, if they give you information and you're running like a chicken without its head, trying to, figure out what's going on and, just making a muck of things, inmates like, okay, this guy has no control or she has no control of anything. And they start to play you. But if you give an inmate information and you kind of passively, take it in and kind of be strategic with that information, and obviously not taking everything at face value, slowing it down a bit. Again, we're talking about non-emergent. We're talking about, credible information, but you can kind of just, work your way, test the source, test the information, and then attack it in a strategic way. That shows that you're in control. That's the key. You have to control your response to the information that's being provided to you in a manner that does not seem that you're desperate, because if you're desperate, inmates will say, okay, I can play you, and next thing you know, you're running around with no control and a sense of obligation to the inmate that's giving you this information. And Russ, obviously you believe that, right? Inmates will sometimes test to see if you have a level of control over the information that they're providing you.
Yeah, especially if they feel that it's going to put them at risk. Because you shouldn't be sharing that information with anyone except someone that's upstream from you in the level. Because if you're sharing this with all of your staff around you, there's just that many more chances for that little leak to occur. And it's not necessarily going to be purposeful, but it's just that thing that happens. Inmates are a lot more complex and a lot smarter than we often give them credit for. And just, a word here, a word there, a look, a stare, the wrong body language can give it all away. I know it does to me when I've been working these people. So I know that, some of them, they're on that level too.
Right. And you know what, guys? Also, you want to be discreet. Again, not just with the handling of the information, but how you get that information. I feel that sometimes people make it obvious. They may walk into a unit and then you always see that individual, that officer or whatever it is, with that same inmate, and believe it or not, that relationship can wind up putting you both at risk, even if the inmate's not telling you anything. That's why, you want to keep that relationship with that inmate pretty much on a high and by, and if there's any job-related concerns in the middle, and that's it. Be done with it. Don't socialize. Don't sit there and hang out on their wing with them and chat with them. Because again, first of all, they could be playing you. They could be distracting you. But on another note, you just hanging out with them and just shooting the breeze like that, it could put people's lives at risk, especially if there is something going on or a sudden shakedown. And let's say, you don't know nothing about it, and the inmate that, was chatting with you all day doesn't know nothing about it, but all of a sudden the other inmates are going to look and say, well, he must have said something because they were talking all day, and next thing you know, putting two and two together, they started shaking up our wing, so that's why our relationship with the inmates should be just pretty much the bare essentials. And if there's information, you collect it, you keep moving, and you plan the best way to strategically react to that information without putting anybody at risk. Especially, as I said, if sometimes you have that immediate need, and I understand that, but sometimes there could be a little delay, because at the end of the day, your reaction can actually help the inmates determine who gave you that information. That's why it's very important how you react. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, that's absolutely essential, and I can't emphasize enough the number of times where I'd have an inmate give me information, especially on where something was, and I would know it was right there, but I couldn't. There's no way that I could go get that whatever it was, because that would just give it away because of the reputation that I had. Right. And so I'd have to find a way to hem-haw around and arrange for another officer to stumble into where it was, so he didn't go to it directly, but he ended up accidentally finding it again somehow. And sometimes we would go through this, bizarre dance of events to make sure that we got a phone or some weed or whatever it was, because I couldn't go get it direct, because it was my information from an inmate that was giving it to me. But there was no way for me to get it direct without tipping them off.
Right.
This guy was the one that was telling me that. And here's another thing. I want to add this too. There's a lot of times where you've been working this guy or something that for whatever reason they end up going bad. They start giving you wrong information, and all of a sudden they turn up dirty in their own right. Don't try and save them. They were working you from the get-go, and that's what was going on. Get over it, charge them, put them in seg, whatever it takes, and move on to the next. There's no loyalties in this, because they were working you. If that's what happened, that's what happened.
And Russ, you made a good point up too, because a lot of inmates knew you were that guy. So anytime you interacted with an inmate, they would probably look at that inmate like, yo, what did you just tell him? So what people may not realize is that your interaction with that inmate, especially if you're considered that guy, could put that inmate at risk for harm, correct?
Yeah, and it can happen in the most innocuous ways too. And I'll give you a good example of it too. And not trying to toot my own horn here or anything, but we had a situation where I walked into a dorm with me and 3 other officers, and we were just doing quick in and outs. And I just pointed to 2 guys, cuff him and cuff him. One had a phone, one had 5 gallons of Pruno. And it wasn't any information that I had, but they knew that I was sometimes running information, and sometimes I would just, find all this stuff. Well, they thought there was a snitch in the dorm then, and I almost got someone beat up over it, even though they weren't my source. And so I did it because it was based on body language. And so sometimes you just got to be careful what you're doing, especially when you have a reputation. It can not be a healthy thing.
And that's why I mentioned, guys, you don't want to have that BS type interaction with inmates. It should be strictly professional. What do you need? And then keep it moving. Now, real quick, before we come to a close, just because we have people from the public that don't understand how important this is, I guess when you get this information from a prison informant, what are some of the things that it can help prevent? Well, drugs, assaults, murders, and not just on the inside. We're talking about stuff that could be credible on the streets. I mean, Russ, some of this good information could prevent a lot of serious crimes, correct?
Oh yeah, especially when you start talking about escapes, and when we're talking cell phones. I mean, there have been cell phones I know in California that have been used to order assaults and murders and all sorts of things. So you can't take any of it lightly. This is very, very serious business that we're talking about here.
Right.
You know, the way I feel about confidential information though is that it's useful, but don't let that be the only tool in your belt. And because it's too hard I mean, it can get away from you. It's great while it's working well, and then suddenly it's not, and things go to hell. Have a lot of other things that you can, you know, fall back on and augment to work with you to stop the crimes. Because this is actually a lot of people don't understand. We were talking about before. Yes, we are law enforcement, and even more than just, you know, law enforcement, we're crime fighters.
Yes. And you know what, Russ, you know, as we come to a close, guys, ultimately we have this conversation to show you that it is a needed element in our environment because it helps add to the safety and security of the facility. But again, it's only if the information is handled correctly, which means that there's no confidence between you and an inmate, especially that front line. You need to pass the information up, and the action has to be strategic because, again, there's so much involved when it comes to reacting to that information, which includes the protection of the individual who provided you that information. You don't want to overlook that. You know, don't overlook that because, again, that also builds with your credibility. You know, you may have that trust where inmates may come up to you and they may be giving you good information. But I'll tell you something right now, mishandle it just once and put their lives at risk, and you're never going to be a source for any information for anybody else. Because at the end of the day is no one's going to trust you enough to provide you with any form of information. Plus, guys, inmates know how this works. It's part of the culture. You know, they know the game that's here, and some are well aware of how they can use information to manipulate favor, to manipulate reward. But there are many who just want to have an easy life behind that wall, and the information they give you is very, very credible because, again, it's information that's provided to you so you can make sure that the facility is safe and secured and keep things running normal. But when you get the information, 9 times out of 10, there's always a motivation. Don't run blindly until you understand the motivation of why that inmate is giving you the information. Filter the inmate just as much as you would filter the information that they're providing you. Know the motivation. Hey, Russ, you have any thoughts in closing?
No, just that, you know, I want people to take this information, think about it, work with it, you know, develop their own little strategies and stuff. There's a lot of things that, you know, you can think upon your own that can, you know, augment this or help you with, you know, the paperwork and the report writing that comes along with it. Be safe, you know, be genuine, take your oath seriously, take policy, procedure seriously. And if you get stuck in a position that you're not sure about, seek out someone that's been at it a long time, man. Reach out to those investigative staff and say, hey, look, I was looking at this one thing and now all of a sudden it's different or whatever. You know, let them help you sort it out, man. There's no pride to be hurt here because we're dealing with lives.
And guys, that's 100%. Thanks, Russ. And guys, real quick, anytime we get information at any point, that information could travel its way up to the court system. And that's when people start questioning you and question the credibility of your sources and the information that they provide. So granted, you may get that one good piece of information, but if you have a history of just running on desperation and you don't know how to make your sources seem credible, because again, look what you have to try to make credible. You know, you're going to get inmates there that are questionable at best, but maybe there's that one day where they give you good information. You have to make that information credible. And again, that's what's going to hold weight when they go to prosecute. And if you can't make that information credible, you may have someone that committed a crime that's going to go off scot-free because, yeah, you had good information, and yeah, the inmate that gave it to you was spot on, but you couldn't establish the credibility with your informant. That's why it's very important to always filter the information and check the credibility of your informant. Make sure that you, like Russ said, cross the T's, dot the I's with them, that you know them well, and you understand their motivation. Because people are going to ask you, why do you think this inmate gave you that information? That's a great question. Because when you answer that question, you answer the motivation, that helps you determine the whys. And the why is going to show you the game that could be played or technically, you know, maybe the motivation is something just as simple as, I'm living here, man, and I'm just tired of you guys coming down on our wing. But if you're not asking why, if you don't have sources on your sources, you're not doing your job. And you're going to wind up running around like a chicken without a head. You're going to put yourself at risk, the facility at risk, the inmates that are giving you information at risk. And ultimately, another side note, a little less, but you're going to be seen as a fool. You're going to be played, and the inmates are going to have no respect for you. And then you're going to wind up getting information from all sources that are just not credible. And in desperation, you're going to wind up doing the wrong thing. And again, it's just going to be putting people at risk. So as always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell is going to notify you every time I post up a video. All right, guys, stay safe.